Okay, so I'm going to go to the election of 1856. So we're 5 years away from the Civil War. And if you look at this map, you may notice that there's a division occurring. And maybe the country's already been divided. And heck, maybe our country's still divided right now based on current politics. But you look, what you see is a clear blue in the north, right? And a lot of red in the south, but not entirely, right? You see some states still up here in the north that are Democrat. Now, notice the colors are different from what we think of now. Kind of interesting in this map. This map has a colors Democrat labeled in red, and this is James Buchanan, who's going to win the election of 1856, um, and Republican labeled in blue. At least that's what they use for this map. The other thing that's maybe interesting, some other conclusions we can make from this map is Buchanan was kind of wishy-washy. Like he tried to please both sides on the issue of slavery, and maybe that's what helped get him elected. But what's interesting is the power of this newly formed Republican Party already in 1856 and the number of states they carried. And the fact that John C. Fremont, who is very much against slavery's expansion and is close to being an abolitionist based on some actions he'll do during the Civil War, that he wins so many states. So we're seeing a clear divide here. We do see a little bit left of the Whig Party. Okay, just a wee bit left of the Whig Party with Millard Fillmore. You also see here the American and the Know Nothing Party. Now, the Know Nothings were a party that were secretive. That's why they said Know Nothings. But their stance was anti-immigrant. Now, this group here is going to eventually be absorbed into the Republican Party, which is troubling to some Republicans, even Lincoln. We know this from letters he wrote to Joshua Speed. He was not fond of the know-nothings. He was not anti-immigrant. But what's the one consistency that's happening with the Republican Party? And the consistency is free labor ideology and against the slave labor ideology and against the spread of slavery. And the know nothings are that. Get absorbed into the Republican Party for that reason. Okay. All right. Okay. So I'll make sure there's no other notes here on. Now, the other thing to mention here is that we do see some serious divisions developing in the Democratic Party. And some of those divisions are going to lead to Democrats joining the Republican Party, or at least being anti-secession. And actually, Stephen Douglas is going to be part of that division because Douglas is going to end up supporting popular sovereignty over the Lecompton Constitution, which maybe you remember allowed for slavery in Kansas, no matter how you voted on it. The Lecompton Constitution was the first proposed constitution, or a proposed constitution, there were several, in Kansas that allowed for the existence of slavery. And there's a provision in it, if you voted against it, that people already had slaves there could still keep them. Well, Douglas was against this. And why was Douglas against this? Because Douglas believed in popular sovereignty, and he felt like the Lecompton Constitution was going against popular sovereignty. Another event that Douglas will be against, another decision, transition here, is the Dred Scott decision. And it's interesting that Douglas is against this because Douglas, sometimes Stephen Douglas is seen as being pro-slavery. I think that's inaccurate. What Douglas was is he was pro-popular sovereignty, and he was definitely not an abolitionist, and he definitely did not believe in equality among blacks and whites, which will come out in the Lincoln Douglas debates, which you took a look at before break, and I might bring up a little bit in this lecture today. But Douglas will be against this case because he feels like this violates the principle of popular sovereignty. Now, why do I bring this up? Because this is going to hurt him later on. This is going to hurt him in the South because the South wants expansion of slavery and they like this Dred Scott decision. They like the Lecompton Constitution, and Douglas's stances against those are going to hurt him. Now, why am I bringing all this up? Well, we're seeing some division in the Democratic Party as well, where Northern Democrats are more like Douglas in favor of popular sovereignty, and then Southern Democrats are in favor of slavery's extension no matter what. Okay. So, Dred Scott, and this is probably a case you've heard of. It's a pretty famous court case, maybe infamous court case in United States history, famous for a bad way. But Dred Scott's a slave. He'll be taken from the slave state of Virginia. And there's more to the story here than what I can give you. There's a complexity to it. But what I can tell you in this short time is that he was taken by one of his owners. He had a few different owners across his lifetime, okay, at least two that I can think of. But he'll be taken by his master to the free state of Illinois and the free territory of Wisconsin. Douglas has a family. He wants himself and his family to be free, right? So he comes up with a strategy here, or an idea. Since I've been in these free states, since I've been a resident of these free states, therefore I should be free. And so he files suit. You may ask yourself, how is a slave able to file a lawsuit? Well, abolitionists will support him in this. Abolitionists will raise funds and support him in this. And as I'm sure you know, court decisions take a very long time to get decided. Remember, democracy is not efficient. He files this suit in 1846, and the resolution of it isn't going to occur until 1857. Now, he had gone with his master to Illinois in 1836, and then on to Wisconsin 2 years later. Okay. So once again, I've been a resident in a free state, therefore I should no longer be free, is the basic premise of this case. And there were some laws in those states that stated that. So he was trying to use those state laws to sue to obtain his freedom. Okay. Couple maps here that I've showed you before, just reminding you of things. It's been a couple weeks, right? So Dred Scott had resided in Illinois in what'll be Wisconsin up here. At the time that happened in 1836, the spread of slavery was subject to the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise stated, okay, Missouri, you can be a state, you can be a slave state. Maine will be a free state to keep that the congressional balance, but any territory above 3630 from here on out will be free, right? So once again, Dred Scott, I've been in these states. These are free states, right? But basically, Dred Scott had lived in states where slavery had been prohibited by the Northwest Ordinance, all right, and the Missouri Compromise. Once again, Illinois and Wisconsin. Now, of course, the Missouri Compromise will be hurt, okay, maybe even essentially repealed by the Compromise of 1850, okay, but it'll really be done away with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which will state, and remember Douglas championed this, Stephen Douglas, when the Kansas-Nebraska Act states that slavery in these territories will be based on popular sovereignty, okay. So now where does that leave somebody like Dred Scott? Well, this case will go all the way to the Supreme Court and will be resolved in 1857. And once again, how was Dred Scott able to maintain this? There are abolitionist groups across the country who are championing him, providing him with lawyers and so on and so forth so that he can do this, right? Chief Justice at the time, Roger Taney, will write the decision. There were 9 members on the Supreme Court. It will be a 7-2 decision. Now, key to note here is that Taney himself is a slaveholder, as most of the Supreme Court members were, so maybe that influenced their decision a little bit, arguably. The only thing that is supposed to influence the decision of Supreme Court justices is the Constitution. But of course, over the years, Supreme Courts have been accused of being too political at times, either conservatively or liberally, okay? Now, first of all, Scott does not receive his freedom. which maybe that should have been the only decision. But Chief Justice Taney and those who supported his decision, and he wrote the decision, decide to take it a step further. Basically, they take it upon themselves to make a decision that they believe will solve this slavery issue once and for all. And if you look at these last two bullets here, these will be very alarming decisions, particularly to abolitionists. Basically, what Taney says, or what his court said, 7-2 decision, is blacks were not citizens and had no citizenship rights. Now, maybe that's not too alarming because most people in this time period believe that anyway. But because of that, what Taney said was Congress cannot prohibit slavery anywhere. Basically, what the court said was a slave is a piece of property, right? It's like, I don't know, taking your horse-drawn carriage across state, right? That's yours. You can do with it as you see fit. And so therefore, since a slave is a piece of property, there's nothing that Congress can do to prevent it. That because you have individual property rights, okay, there's nothing Congress can do to prevent this, which is an interesting decision because if you think of it, we all own pieces of property like cars and so forth, but we are somewhat limited in what we can do with our cars, right? There are regulations with our cars, but Taney is saying because a slave is a piece of property, Congress cannot prohibit it anywhere. Okay. So once again, this court is trying to basically solve this slavery issue once and for all. He goes on to state in his written statement concerning this decision that the Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, those were essentially unconstitutional because Congress had no power to regulate slavery, regardless even of what territorial legislatures want. I mean, indeed, the decision seemed to state that even a state and local government could regulate slavery. That if a person owned a slave, they could take it anywhere they want. You know, if Wakeman, Ohio, right, where I was raised, right, wanted to outlaw slavery, too bad, right? Because a slave is a person's piece of property. You can imagine that this decision sent shockwaves through the abolitionist community. So let's look at the impact of it. This infuriated many in the North. Many were very angry about this, okay, because many people have been living in slaves, or I'm sorry, in North, you're probably living in a free state. And basically what Taney is saying, there can be no free states. You can take a slave anywhere you want. Now, Southerners saw this as a validation for previous arguments. Southerners have been saying this all along. Slave is my property. I should be able to do with him what I want. I paid for him, right? You can't tell me what to do with him. I could take him wherever I want. I could take him to Kansas. I can take him to Massachusetts. It doesn't matter, okay? Opponents of slavery now feared that slavery might spread into additional areas, including states that were once free. Okay. Indeed, there had been a lot of writings by abolitionists in this time period, and Abraham Lincoln himself feared this based on some things that he wrote, that there was a slave power conspiracy trying to control the government and trying to allow for the existence of slavery anywhere. And they feared that with this Taney decision, that was coming true. Okay. And this again reinforced the argument that slavery was a national problem, not a regional one. Okay. So this is a key, very key development on the way to civil war. This is a polarizing decision within the country. Arguably Taney overstepping his bounds. Just pausing again for a moment here because there's a lot of notes on this slide. Now, in the midst of all of this decision of 1857, there's also an economic panic. So there's a panic of 1857. I'm sure you know that when we say panic, we mean economic downturn, right? And this was caused by several different things. I really don't have time to, and I don't know if I'm an expert on this panic anyway, but I don't really have time to perhaps, you could do a whole lecture on this panic, but suffice it to say that this panic was caused by inflation, increase in the price of gold, which money was based on in this time period. It had to have gold backing, right? Overproduction of grain, over speculation in land and railroads. Kind of maybe think to your Great Depression causes when people were investing in the stock market and uh, in dangerous ways, increasing their debt as a result. Now, cotton prices will stay high through all of this, and I think that's key to note here. Grain prices, which is a key factor in the North, will drop. And part of the issue here now, so as a result of this, the North is going to demand higher tariffs. And sometimes a key issue is brought up, like sometimes I call them Southern revisionist historians who want to minimize the effect of slavery as a cause of the Civil War. They'll focus on the economics of it, and they'll talk about the punishing tariffs that the North wanted to inflict on the South. That argument doesn't necessarily hold up because if you go back to the Jackson presidency in the 1830s, this arguing over tariffs began then. South Carolina almost left the Union because of high tariffs. And Jackson said, "You're not going to leave the Union. Even though I support you, you're not going to leave the Union," because Jackson believed in the Union. So this is an ongoing issue since the 1830s, but the tariff had decreased since the 1830s. In the 1830s, it was as high as 32%. By 1857, it's down to 20%. And so Northerners are saying, hey, Northerners want the tariff to increase because their products are being hurt by the lowering of the tariff. Whereas cotton, which is much more of an international crop than grain in this time period, is benefits from a lower tariff. So for the South to say that, the tariff had increased or that was the key reason, I don't know that holds water. Now, another consequence of this is that the South again became overconfident with King Cotton. Remember, one of the reasons, and we've mentioned this before, one of the reasons why the South believes it can secede is because of cotton. They believe it's a crop that will keep their economy going. They believe they have the economy to keep going without the North, or even to wage war on the North. And one of the reasons for this is because of the international ties of the cotton trade. They believe that England will support them, for example. It's going to turn out to not be the case. It's going to turn out to not be the case. And we'll get into that as we get into the Civil War in the coming days. Okay. Also in the midst of all this, so let's go to 1858. Now, you guys had an assignment on this before break. Dealt with some Lincoln comments concerning the issue of race and equality, right? So Lincoln-Douglas debates, now you think in the midst of a panic that the panic would be the key topic of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, but it wasn't. The key topic of the Lincoln-Douglas debates will be the issue of slavery. Now let's look at our two key debaters here, right? Stephen Douglas, of course, somebody you've met. He's the incumbent senator from Illinois. He'd be key in negotiating the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed for popular sovereignty. And remember, once again, the Compromise of 1850 had allowed for the admission of California as a free state, established popular sovereignty and enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, and the end of the slave trade in D.C. So that was the Compromise of 1850, which are on some other slides. You'll be able to use those notes for your test next week. Okay. Now, Stephen Douglas is a supporter of westward expansion. He's a supporter of popular sovereignty. He wants expansion west. He wants to build his transcontinental railroad and all those things. And he will sponsor legislation. Well, I already mentioned that he sponsored legislation concerning the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Okay. Now, once again, just because I said that kind of quickly, remember the Compromise of 1850 allowed for the admission of California as a free state, established the concept of popular sovereignty in the territories. Kansas-Nebraska Act will solidify that. And then enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, which is maybe the most controversial provision of the Compromise of 1850. And then the end of the slave trade in Washington, D.C. So I'd review that with you really quick. Lincoln, right? Abraham Lincoln, a little bit of background on him. I'm sure you know the story, log cabin, all that stuff, right? Very humble origins. He will go on to be a successful Illinois lawyer, even though very self-educated. Um, he was literally born in a log cabin in Kentucky. Uh, Spent his childhood in Indiana, then moved to Illinois in his early 20s. You may remember that he served one term in the U.S. House, and what he was noted for in the U.S. House of Representatives at his term in the 1840s was his opposition to the Mexican War. Now, he opposed the Mexican War because he felt it was a war for expansion, and because it was in the South, it was going to lead to the expansion of slavery. He questioned James K. Polk and uh, sending troops to cause a conflict. Where were the first shots fired? That's what he questioned Polk on. Was it on American land or Mexican land? Basically, he was accusing Polk of starting the war, not Mexico. Now, even though he raised this opposition, he will vote to support the troops every time. So whenever there was a provision in Congress to supply the troops, he did not vote against that, which is kind of a typical congressional practice. Even when representatives and senators oppose wars, they often don't vote against supplying the troops. They usually tend to keep them supplied anyway. He was a member of the newly formed Republican Party, and indeed had helped organize the newly formed Republican Party. And once again, his most consistent stance was he was opposed to expansion of slavery into the territories. This was always his most consistent stance. His degree of abolitionism is always debated. He will never be an immediate abolitionist, or at least until the 13th Amendment. I guess at that point he will be, but he is not like William Lloyd Garrison, who wants abolition now. I think, maybe you could argue that Lincoln would like to see abolition now. He just doesn't think that it can due to the complexity of the issue in 1858. Now, some key things to mention. Now, we focused before break on the issue of race and equality, and Douglas and Lincoln sparring on this issue a little bit. There are some other big things to mention with these debates. And remember, these debates were attended by thousands of people, even though they lasted hours. This was like the baseball and football of the time period, believe it or not. People went out and they attended these debates and they cheered one dude or the other, right? These two Senate candidates of Illinois debated national politics in the wake of the Dred Scott decision, and that'll weigh heavily over their debates, okay? Lincoln, as I mentioned, was opposed to slavery but rejected abolitionism in 1858. Basically, what he believed in is he believed in gradual emancipation and the prevention of slavery's expansion. He'll also explore the possibility of colonization, and really well into his presidency. I mean, even when he's considering issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, he's still bringing up the possibility of colonization, which can be somewhat troubling when you look at his legacy. But this was something that he looked at for quite a while. The Freeport Doctrine. So in Freeport, Illinois, a key moment in the debates occurred where Lincoln directly challenged Douglas on the issue of popular sovereignty and the Dred Scott decision and things like the Lecompton Constitution, which seemed to be going against it. And basically what Lincoln said is, Douglas, what do you think? Should it be the Supreme Court that determines slavery in a territory, or the people themselves? And Douglas said, well, it should be the people themselves. I support popular sovereignty. So Douglas argued people in territories could prohibit slavery, even if the Supreme Court determined otherwise. Now, this once again hurts his standing in the South. The South is very much, Southern slaveholders, they like the Dred Scott decision, right? So this is going to hurt him. This at one time, if you were betting money on a future president, Stephen Douglas was a pretty safe bet. But this is going to hurt him because he's not going to be able to carry the South because he essentially here comes out against the Dred Scott decision. He says popular sovereignty should determine slavery, not a Supreme Court decision. Southern slaveholders and Southern supporters of slavery, they don't like that. And that's going to hurt him. So he's going to win re-election to the Senate in 1858, but his presidential chances are damaged by the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Good insight to Douglas's character. At least he stood firm on his issues, right? Now, Lincoln, he loses this, but this really gets him back into the national spotlight. And Lincoln, after he had lost, he'd ran for, he was no longer a member of the House. He had lost this Senate debate. He had lost a series of elections at this point, thought he was done. But this gets him back in the spotlight because he did well in these debates. Segments of his speeches will be printed nationally, and he becomes a rising star once again in this newly formed Republican Party. And 2 years later, 1860, he's going to win the presidential election. All right. It's 1:44. Let me just close with one more thing here. And that is John Brown's raid, which some people consider the opening of the Civil War sometimes. Maybe Bleeding Kansas was, right? Maybe there's a Civil War already going on in Kansas. Okay. You've met John Brown before. Josh, once again, I know you know a lot about him based on your research. Okay. It's very safe to say that John Brown was a radical abolitionist. Remember what happened in the Pottawatomie Massacre in Kansas? He had killed supporters of slavery in a raid there, basically in response to supporters of slavery attacking Lawrence, Kansas. John Brown disagrees with William Lloyd Garrison on one thing. He thinks it's going to take violence to end slavery. Remember, William Lloyd Garrison was a pacifist. He didn't think violence was the way to end slavery. Maybe you can see some similarities in debates between someone like John Brown and a William Lloyd Garrison to Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, who believed that, in any means necessary, and Martin Luther King believed in nonviolence, right? John Brown believes it's going to take violence to end this, and he's going to carry out yet another violent act. He's going to try and start a revolution, and that is when he attempts to capture the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and lead a slave uprising. He will successfully capture the arsenal. This is going to be in October of that year. 7 people will be killed in seizing the arsenal. The uprising will be put down, and it's going to be put down by Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee, who was serving in the American Army and will go on to be the leader of the Confederate Army. A little bit more on this before I leave you today, kids. Let me finish talking about John Brown's raid here. Now, it's 1859, right? Year before the Civil War. John Brown attacked this arsenal. It's a large arsenal of federal weapons, hoping to start a slave insurrection. Maybe his biggest mistake is he should have broadcasted it more, and maybe let the slaves know about it. But the reality is, Brown and his small group had fought against the U.S. government. And when you fight against the U.S. government, and you're a U.S. citizen, that can be considered treason, right? He attacked a federal arsenal. So he's going to be captured, he's going to be put on trial, and he's going to be executed in 1859. Now, he went to execution very nobly. He believed in his cause, and he was noble all the way to the grave. And this will only enhance his martyr status. A martyr is someone who dies for a cause, right? So I have the status of a martyr in the North, at least among abolitionists. Now, this is a famous, this is an artist's rendering of John Brown's walk to his execution, to his hanging. This never occurred here. He didn't kiss a black baby on the way. That was the artist embellishment of that event. But he did go to it very nobly, with bravery, I should say. His last words were, "This is a beautiful country." And he had written in his prison cell before he died, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land can never be purged but with blood." And that's pretty prophetic, right? Because we're about 2 years away from a year and a half at this point away from Civil War. Okay. Now, last slide of the day. Impact of this. The impact is that we know that there were Northern abolitionists who supported John Brown's scheme. He tried to recruit Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass basically thought it was suicide. I mean, he tried to get Frederick Douglass to go along. And Frederick Douglass was an intelligent man. He was also a very strong man. So he might have been a good guy to have in this raid. But Douglass basically thought it was suicide, so he didn't go. This correspondence, the revelation that abolitionists had supported John Brown in this, was alarming to many in the South. Southerners could not believe that some abolitionists had funded this man. You know, Southerners viewed him as treasonous. Southerners viewed him as insane, right? In the North, as I mentioned, he's going to be treated like a martyr, not a traitor. Okay, at least in some parts of the North, at least in abolitionist circles, those who want to end slavery. And once again, a martyr is someone who dies for a cause, right? When he was executed, bells tolled, flags were lowered, rallies were held, and one of the Union Army, each Union Army had songs, right, in this time period to rally them. The Union Army rallying song would be John Brown's body. When the Union Army would march, they often would sing, and the lyrics and the chorus was like, "His soul is marching on." Whose soul are they talking about? They're talking about John Brown. This will be part of the battle hymn of the Republic. Some in the South, as a result of John Brown's raid, believe that many in the North were abolitionists willing to fight to free slaves. And they were right. There were many in the North who were willing to do that. Now, not a majority. Most people in the North were not willing to fight to free slaves, but there were many who were. Most people in the North, when they enlist to fight, they're all about preserving the Union. They're not necessarily about fighting to free slaves, but there were many, not a majority, okay, that were willing to fight to free slaves. And the question is this a final straw? Perhaps not. The final straw that will lead to secession will be the election of 1860, one in which Lincoln wins. And what I'm going to do on Thursday is I'm going to pick up with that and then get into the Civil War itself on Thursday. Finally. Okay. Any questions of me, kids?
Would I be able to talk to you about the paper real quick after class?
Yeah, and that was going to be my next question. Does anybody have questions about the paper? And keep sending me